What we call Germany today is a shell of its former self. It was, in the 18th century, a conglomeration of more than 300 independent kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities. By 1849, that number had been reduced, but a unified German nation-state still didn't exist. Mackensen was born into the Prussian state. Mackensen came into the world in the immediate aftermath of a massive political upheaval. The 1848 revolutions turned out to be unsuccessful. The Frankfurt Parliament was dissolved, the ruling princes repressed the risings by military force, and the German Confederation was re-established by 1850. So the world was one where liberal democracy's hopes had been crushed and conservative monarchical order had been reasserted. The political climate would deeply shape the values of the generation. Europe at the time was still largely shaped by the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which had tried to create a stable balance of power after Napoleon. Britain, France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia were all competing. The British and the French were building overseas empires. The Russian Tsar was expanding into Central Asia. The Austrian Habsburg were sinking into a cauldron of national tensions, while the Prussians had the opposite problem. The Germans were fragmented into petty kingdoms not yet unified. August Mackensen was born on December 6, 1849, in Haus Leibnitz, near the village of Dahlenberg. This was in the Prussian province of Saxony, to Ludwig and Mary Louise Mackensen. His father was a state administrator. Mackensen was not born of nobility. He was a commoner's son in a society where the military, especially the cavalry, was almost entirely from the aristocratic class. At a young age, his father sent him to a school called Realschule of the Frank Foundations in 1865, seemingly hoping his eldest son would follow him in his profession. This is revealing on two levels. First, his father's ambition for August was modest, carry on the family trade of estate management. Secondly, the type of school matters. The school he was sent to was a 9-year secondary school focusing on Latin, modern languages, science, and mathematics. It was a school of ambitious middle-class families, not the elite. But then something happened that changed everything. In 1869, at age 19, rather than continue toward a career in estate management, Mackensen interrupted his university studies to enlist as a 1-year volunteer in the 2nd Life Hussar Regiment. The Hussar originally came from Hungary during the late 15th century, emerging as a response to the rising threat of the Ottoman invasion. Their primary role was that of light cavalry, skilled in scouting, raiding, and harassment of heavier units. Think of them as the special forces of the pre-modern era, fast-moving, independent, and operating behind enemy lines, living off their wits in horsemanship. The Hussar model proved so effective that every major European power eventually adopted a version of their own, including Poland, Austria, France, and Prussia. Each country molded their Hussar units to fit their military needs while preserving some of the characteristics of the original Hungarian units. By the time Mackensen was born, the Prussian Hussars had evolved considerably from their irregular raiding origins into something far more structured, but they still retained their aura of elite fighting. This next part is speculation because there is no definitive proof on why he wanted to join this elite force, but we have some theories. Firstly, the Hussars represented the pinnacle of military romance and prestige in Prussian culture. For a young man raised on the stories of Frederick the Great's campaign, this was the ultimate expression of the warrior ideal. Secondly, the Hussar regiment had a specific tradition of horsemanship that would have deeply appealed to a young man from an agricultural background. He grew up around horses and understood them. Mackensen excelled in equitation, a proficiency that later defined his reputation as a cavalry leader. And perhaps most importantly, the Prussian army was one of the very few places in Prussian society where a talented commoner could actually rise on his merit. Mackensen would join one regiment that stood above all others, a Einjährig Freiwilliger, or 1-year volunteer, which allowed educated young men from the middle class to serve a shortened military term rather than the standard 3 years, and potentially earn an officer's commission if they distinguished themselves. It was one of the few genuine ladders of social mobility in Prussian society, and Mackensen grabbed it. The regiment he chose was no ordinary unit. The Life Hussar Regiment wore the Totenkopf, the death's head, on their shakos, with the motto Mit Gott für König und Vaterland. These were elite, prestigious, deeply traditional cavalry units with a battlefield lineage stretching back to the Napoleonic Wars. For a commoner to join, let alone aspire to lead, such a regiment was extraordinarily ambitious. When Mackensen enlisted in October 1869, Europe had been relatively peaceful for several years, following Prussia's crushing defeat of Austria in 1866. But the peace was deceptive. Enormous tensions were building between France and Prussia, and both nations knew another confrontation was coming. The trigger, when it arrived, was almost mundane compared to the forces it unleashed. The war was caused primarily by France's determination to reassert its dominant position in continental Europe, which appeared in question following the decisive Prussian victory over Austria. After Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern was offered the vacant Spanish throne in 1817, the French ambassador approached Prussian King William I, demanding Prussia renounce any future claims, which Wilhelm rejected. This was reported to Berlin on July 13th, and Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck quickly made it public with deliberate altered wording. That altercation was calculated genius on Bismarck's part. Bismarck skillfully used the telegram to provoke France into declaring war. He rewrote the dispatch to make it appear both sides had insulted each other, inflaming public opinions in both countries. France walked straight into the trap. On July 16, 1870, the French Parliament voted to declare war on Prussia. France invaded German territory on the 2nd of August. The German coalition mobilized its troops much more effectively than the French and invaded northeastern France 2 days later. The 20-year-old volunteer from Saxony had been in uniform barely a year when the war began. He trained with the 2nd Life Hussars, but he had never fired a shot in a real battlefield. Now he was about to participate in one of the most consequential wars in 19th century European history. The military confrontation saw early French victories overshadowed by Prussian efficiency and technological superiority, culminating in major defeats for France at Sedan and Metz. These losses led to the capture of Emperor Napoleon III and the proclamation of the French Republic. Despite attempts at resistance, Paris ultimately surrendered in January 1871. The French commanders appear to have failed utterly to use their available cavalry for effective reconnaissance, limiting their efforts to placing staff officers as observers in cathedral belfries. The French generals were essentially blind. They did not know where the Prussian armies were, how large they were, or what they intended. The Prussian generals, by contrast, were fed a constant stream of intelligence from their cavalry patrols, including units like the 2nd Life Hussar that Mackensen rode with. This asymmetry of information was as decisive as any superiority in guns or numbers. Mackensen, as a young Hussar trooper conducting these patrols, was directly contributing to the Prussian command's ability to see and maneuver in ways that the French simply could not match. The Prussian army that Mackensen served in was a revolutionary instrument. It used the railways to move troops at unprecedented speed, had superior artillery, and operated through a general staff system that allowed initiative at lower command levels in ways the French couldn't match. For a young volunteer cavalryman, this was an education in modern warfare that no classroom could provide. Mackensen served with distinction during the Franco-Prussian War as a Wehrmeister. In this elite unit, he was engaged in major battles at Beaumont, Sedan, and Orleans. The first major engagement Mackensen's regiment was involved in was Beaumont, 2 days before Sedan. This battle is less famous than Sedan, but it is important for understanding how the trap was set. The Battle of Beaumont on August 30th, 1870 was fought between the French 5th Corps under General Pierre-Louis Charles Defied and 4th Corps under Constantin von Aisleben, 12th Corps under Prince Georg of Saxony, along the 1st Royal Bavarian Corps. The French were surprised in their cantonments and driven back, with losses of 7,500 men and 42 guns. The word surprised in that account is everything. The French were caught in their resting quarters, meaning they were not in battle formation. They were cooking food, sleeping, and attending to horses. The Prussian cavalry's constant reconnaissance had located them precisely. Prussian forces moved to encircle and attack before the French even knew they were coming. The result was carnage, thousands of casualties, and the loss of artillery pieces in a single day. For Mackensen and his fellow hussars, Beaumont had been the kind of engagement where the reconnaissance work paid off directly and visibly. They were the eyes that found the French camp. They were the scouts who reported the position back to Prussian commanders. The battle that followed was in no small part a product of their work. After Beaumont, the shattered French 5th Corps retreated to the town of Sedan. Having reformed in the town, the army of Chalons was immediately isolated by the converging Prussian army. The trap was closing. Sedan deserves particular attention because it was the decisive battle of the entire war. The 130-strong French army of Chalons, commanded by Marshal Patrice de MacMahon and accompanied by Napoleon III himself, had been attempting to lift the siege of Metz, only to be caught by the Prussian Fourth Army and defeated at the Battle of Beaumont in August. Commanded by General Marshal Helmuth von Moltke and accompanied by Prussian King Wilhelm I and Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the Fourth Army and the Prussian Third Army encircled MacMahon's army at Sedan. The human experience of being trapped inside that was hellish. Within Sedan, there was nothing but mounting chaos, as the French were hammered by more than 400 German guns mounted in a semicircle on the high ground around the town. Shells falling from all directions, officers killed, units breaking and running, men seeking shelter in buildings or cellars, anywhere to escape the relentless fire. During the battle, a French cavalry charge was defeated by Prussian infantry and artillery fire. The Prussian artillery batteries took up positions along slopes overlooking the French army, driving the army of Chalon north into the Bois de la Garonne, where it was surrounded. The French cavalry's attempt to break out were some of the most heartbreaking moments of the entire war. In desperation, the French launched their remaining cavalry division in repeated charges against the Prussians, attempting to clear a path for the rest of their force to escape. But each time, the Prussian line held firm. The French reformed and charged again, suffering heavy losses each time. Even the watching Prussians were moved by it. A story spread that the last few survivors, coming forward to charge again, were saluted by the Prussian infantry who let them pass to safety. For Mackensen, as a Hussar watching this, there was a powerful lesson embedded in this moment. Courage alone meant nothing against disciplined firepower in superior numbers. The French cavalry were as brave as any other soldier who ever lived, and they were being systematically annihilated. What mattered was not just personal bravery, but intelligence, positioning, coordination, and the ability to strike when the enemy was weak rather than when they were strong. It was a catastrophic French defeat. For the Prussians, including the young Mackensen, it was a moment of almost intoxicating triumph. When war broke out with France in July, Mackensen fought at Sedan and led a reconnaissance patrol that resulted in his division commander personally nominating him for the Iron Cross. This was life-changing for Mackensen. Here was a 20-year-old commoner's son, one-year volunteer with no noble connections, performing well enough in the chaos of a major battle that his commanding officer singled him out for the highest Prussian military decoration. After Sedan, the war continued. France refused to surrender even after Napoleon III's capture, and a new Republican government organized desperate resistance. The Prussians were now besieging Paris and fighting off French relief armies across the Loire Valley. It was in this phase of the war, during operations around Orleans, that Mackensen had another defining moment. A Hussar reconnaissance patrol was one of the most dangerous assignments in 19th century warfare. Small groups of cavalrymen rode ahead of the army, deep into enemy territory, gathering intelligence about French troop positions, roads, and defenses. There was no support. If you encountered a large French force, you ran. If you encountered a small one, you might fight. The entire enterprise depended on speed and horsemanship. What Mackensen did was lead a charge during one of these patrols, meaning he encountered French troops rather than withdrawing, he attacked. That December 4th, he took several French prisoners. For this act of aggressive initiative deep in hostile territory, he earned the Iron Cross and his promotion from the ranks to a full commissioned officer. This moment is worth dwelling on because it reveals something fundamental about Mackensen's character that would define his entire career. He was not a cautious man by nature. When confronted with danger, his instinct was to attack rather than to retreat. That same aggression would later make him one of the most effective offensive commanders of the First World War. On December 12th, he was promoted to lieutenant in the Royal Prussian Army Reserve. It was modest in rank, but enormous in significance. He was no longer a volunteer. He was a commissioned officer in the Prussian army. He also witnessed something that shaped his entire understanding of military power. He saw a brilliantly organized, intelligently commanded army destroy, in some respects, better equipped army through superior reconnaissance, superior artillery deployment, superior logistics, and above all, superior strategic vision. He saw Moltke think at the operational level in a way that no previous commander in history had quite managed. He observed these lessons at a young age when the brain is most receptive to them. The consequences of the Franco-Prussian War for European history could not be overstated. On January 18, 1871, Germany reached its official unification, with Wilhelm I accepting the title of Emperor at the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Germany proceeded to annex Alsace-Lorraine from France, which would later cause tensions between the two nations for decades. Germany was now born, and it was born in triumph, in the palace of the French kings. For the generation of young Germans who fought in that war, including Mackensen, this created a psychological template that would never fully fade. Military strength worked. Prussia's disciplined army, its railways, its general staff system, all of it had produced a victory so complete it seemed almost providential. But after all this success, Mackensen left the army and attended the Martin Luther University of Halle-Wittenberg. However, he found himself drawn back to service with the Imperial German Army and rejoined his old regiment in 1873. You might be asking, why did he go back to university at all? It appears Mackensen genuinely wrestled with his future. His father wanted him to have an education and a civilian career. The war had shown him something else entirely about himself, a natural aptitude for military life, a hunger for action and command. But he was still technically a reserve officer, and the path to a permanent full commission in the peacetime army was unclear for a man without aristocratic connections or the money to attend a proper military academy. 2 years at Hale were probably a period of reflection and decision making as much as academic study. And the decision, when he made it, was unambiguous. For better or for worse, he had chosen the military for life. By the end of this period, Mackensen is 24 years old and has already done things most men will never do. He has fought in a major war, been decorated for personal bravery, been promoted under fire, and helped forge the new German nation with his own hands. He has also made the central choice of his life, choosing the military over academic life. But perhaps most significantly, the war gave Mackensen something money and noble birth could not, a battlefield reputation. And the Prussian officer culture, what you had done under fire mattered more than anything else. They opened doors that would have otherwise been closed to a commoner's son. The army was a Praetorian Guard, outside of the Constitution, subject only to the emperor. It existed in a separate social world from civilian Germany, with its own courts of honor, its own codes of conduct, and its own laws about who deserved respect and who did not. At the top of that social world sat the Junker aristocracy. The Junker officer, who was a man with a von in his name, and with an ancestral estate in Brandenburg or East Prussia, with grandfathers who had served under Frederick the Great, occupied a position of social authority that no amount of ability could automatically replace. When a commoner like Mackensen entered a room full of aristocratic officers, he was walking into a space where centuries of social assumption said he did not fully belong. Every day of his peacetime career, he was implicitly required to prove that he deserved to be there. This pressure never fully went away. The daily routine of the Prussian army was structured. The early morning was devoted to cleansing quarters and correcting any irregularities from the previous day's duties. The forenoon hours were given to study arithmetic, geography, geometry, theory and practice of military science. The afternoon was devoted to physical culture, not only military drill, but every variety of physical exercise calculated to add strength, such as running, leaping, vaulting, balancing, bayonet exercise, lifting, and shooting. These were followed by company and regimental parades, and at some intervals by grand field movements of brigades and divisions. This was Mackensen's daily existence for years on end. The peacetime army was in many respects more psychologically demanding than war, because in war you had the clarity of immediate danger to focus the mind, whereas in peacetime you had decades of repetitive routine punctured only by annual maneuvers and the constant social navigation of the officers. In 1873, Mackensen was named Lieutenant of the Life Guard Hussars. 3 years later, in 76, he served as an adjutant to the 1st Cavalry. In 78, he was promoted to First Lieutenant. 2 years later, in 1880, he was chosen for the prestigious German General Staff. As a lieutenant in the regiment, Mackensen would have been responsible for a small number of men, learning the administrative and leadership skills of a junior officer. This is where the story of the Prussian military education system met the practical reality of commanding actual human beings who had their own personalities, problems, and capabilities. The daily routines were extraordinarily difficult. As a cavalry officer, Mackensen was personally responsible for the health and condition of his men's horse as much as the men themselves. Every morning, the horses were inspected. This included feeding, watering, grooming, and the condition of the hooves and shoes, the fit of saddles. All this fell under a officer's supervision. A hussar's combat effectiveness was entirely dependent on the quality of its horses, and the quality of the horses was entirely dependent on the quality of the officers and the NCOs managing them. This was unglamorous, repetitive work, but it also was the foundation of victory on the battlefield. The Prussian army placed great importance on the studies of soldiers. For officers, the educational demands were even more intensive. Military history, map reading, logistics, tactics, and languages. Mackensen, who had already attended university and had a natural analytical mind, excelled at this dimension of the work. By 1876, 3 years into his formal commission, he was trusted enough to be appointed adjutant to the 1st Cavalry. This was a staff role, not a line command. This is a critical important distinction. An adjutant was essentially the principal administrative and coordinating officer for a senior commander. You handled correspondence, organized schedules, managed the flow of information, and essentially kept the entire operation running smoothly. It required intelligence, organization capabilities, discretion, and the interpersonal skill to deal with officers of very different personalities and ranks. The fact that Mackensen was chosen for this role reveals something his superiors had noticed. He was not just a brave cavalry trooper, he had the mind and the temperament for staff work. This was a crucial point in any officer's career. Men who were only good at the physical, tactical dimensions of soldiering eventually hit a ceiling. Men who could combine tactical ability with staff competence were the ones who rose to army command. Mackensen's appointment as adjutant in 1876 was the first sign that his superior saw the latter potential in him. His promotion to the first lieutenant in 1876 was steady. He was simply doing his job extremely well, building a reputation inside the regiment as a reliable, intelligent, physically formidable officer who got things done without drama. In 79, Mackensen did something that had significant social consequences. He married Dorothy von Horn, the sister of a slain comrade. Her father, Karl von Horn, was the influential Ober president of East Prussia. This was not a cold, calculated social marriage. There was genuine emotional connection rooted in shared loss. Karl von Horn, Dorothy's father, held one of the most powerful administrative positions in the entire East Prussian state. The Ober president was the senior royal official in a province, the direct representative of the crown in East Prussia. He was a man of enormous influence, with connections reaching directly into the highest levels of Prussian government and society. By marrying his daughter, Mackensen was entering a social world that was orders of magnitude above anything his lineage had entitled him to. This is not to suggest the marriage was purely strategic. Everything we know about Mackensen suggests that this was a genuine marriage. But the social consequences were real and significant. A young officer who was a commoner's son, without family connections or independent wealth, had married into the elite. His father-in-law moved in circles that Mackensen could now access, and Karl von Horn's quiet support smoothed some of the social obstacles that Mackensen's lineage had placed in his path. August and Dorothea had 5 children, 2 daughters, Elsia and Ruth, and 3 sons, Hans, Manfred, and Eberhard. Their family was deeply Lutheran, gathering around the church calendar for the festivals and observations that structured German Protestant family life. Mackensen's faith was lived out in the domestic life of his family. But all wasn't perfect. Unfortunately, his eldest daughter, Else, died in childhood, a grief that marked the family deeply. The sons would grow up to have careers of their own, but in 1880, Mackensen was appointed to the general staff. To understand why this was remarkable, you need to understand what the general staff was and what it meant in the German military world. The Prussian officer corps had undergone reforms focused on individual merit, which provided opportunities for those with merit in education, but not traditionally of aristocratic breeding. To pursue an officer's commission, applicants were not allowed to compete for entrance into the rank as officer candidates, having to pass competitive written examinations before being co-opted, and subject to royal approval. By the officers of their regiment, the general staff was the brain of the entire army. It was the institution that planned future wars, analyzed past ones, designed the railway timetables for mobilization, and studied the operational problems of fighting unorthodox styles of warfare. Moltke the Elder, chief of the general staff from 57 to 88, had modernized the Prussian army by expanding the general staff and creating peacetime subdivisions, including mobilization, geography statistics, and military history sections. He was a strong proponent of war game training for officers. Entry to the German staff was by far the most competitive and selective process in the entire German army. Officers who attended the War Academy, or the Kriegsakademie, competed fiercely for the small numbers of general staff positions available each year. In 1880, Mackensen was appointed to the general staff, despite not having attended the War Academy, remaining there until 1894. He bypassed the normal 3-year preparation entirely. This was not a routine occurrence. It required someone senior to champion him. That champion was almost certainly Julius von Verdi de Venua. Mackensen found a mentor in the war ministry, Julius von Verdi. This relationship deserves very careful examination, because it was one of the most decisive factors in Mackensen's entire career. So who was Verdi? Julius von Verdi de Venua was a German general staff officer, chiefly noted both for his military writings and his service on Helmut von Moltke the Elder's staff during the Franco-Prussian War. In 1867, he was placed at the head of the intelligence section of the general staff, becoming one of Moltke's principal confidential assistants. Verdi was one of the most brilliant of them all. But you might be asking, why did Verdi take an interest in Mackensen? Mackensen's combat record from the Franco-Prussian War was genuine and impressive. Verdi, who had served as army headquarters throughout the war, would have access to these records, and who had performed them at what level. Mackensen's reputation as a horseman and as a practical, decisive officer was well established in the cavalry world, and perhaps most importantly, Verdi was himself a man who valued demonstrated ability over social background. His entire career had been built on intellectual merit rather than aristocratic birth. His period of greatest influence over Mackensen's career was in the 80s, exactly when Mackensen needed it most. Throughout Verdi's patronage, doors opened. The general staff appointment in 80 was almost certainly the first fruit of this relationship. Promoted captain in 82, Mackensen was named to the general staff of the 14th Division in 85, and 2 years later as Chief of Dragoons for Regiment No. 9. But let's look at what the general staff work actually involved at the divisional level, because it was transformative for Mackensen's intellectual development as a military commander. A divisional general staff officer was responsible for planning. He worked out malicious details, how a division of roughly 15,000 men would move from one place to another, how it would be supplied, how its communications would function, and how its different component parts such as infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers would coordinate with each other. He ran exercises and war games, testing theoretical plans against realistic scenarios. He wrote detailed after-action reports, analyzing what had gone right and what had gone wrong in training exercises. This kind of work forced a completely different mode of thinking than regimental soldiering. As a regimental officer, you led men directly. You made tactical decisions in real time about small units you could see. As a staff officer, you thought in larger scales, longer time horizons, and more complex problems. You had to understand logistics with the same clarity that you understood tactics. You had to think about what happened not just in the first day of the battle, but the third, the fourth, and even the 10th. It took a lot of brain power and mental resilience that most men didn't have. That same year, his friends gave him a plaque with the inscription, quote, "For Captain Mackensen, who will advance with lightning speed and become a general field marshal," end quote. Prophetic words indeed, for one who would later also assert that he wore the same uniform size throughout his entire military career. That last detail is interesting, personally, because it illuminates character in an unexpected way. For nearly 50 years of active military service, through every promotion, every campaign, every decade of age, Mackensen's physical condition never deteriorated. He remained lean and fit from his 20s to his 60s. This speaks to an extraordinary physical discipline, physical training, and careful diet. The man who commanded armies was physically capable of doing so because he had spent his entire adult life maintaining his body as rigorously as he maintained his professional skills. If Verdi de Venua was the man who opened the door to the general staff, Alfred von Schlieffen was the man who shaped Mackensen's deepest understanding of what war was at the highest level. Mackensen was recalled from the regiment to serve as an adjutant to the next chief, von Schlieffen, in office from 91 to 1906, whom Mackensen regarded as a great mentor on how to lead armies of millions. Schlieffen was operating at a strategic scale that dwarfed everything Mackensen had previously encountered. In his 2 years as Schlieffen's adjutant gave him an incomparable education in what the scale of thinking required. Mackensen was present when Schlieffen worked through the ideas that would eventually become the plan that shaped the opening of the First World War. No classroom, no manual, no amount of field exercises would have provided an educational comparable to this. While Schlieffen was the dominant influence during Mackensen's general staff years, Moltke the Elder was still alive and still the chief of the general staff when Mackensen first arrived in 1880. Mackensen's chief, von Moltke, found him a, quote, lovable character, end quote. That phrase, from the most formidable military mind in Europe, is worth sitting with. Moltke was not a sentimental man. He was famous for his intellectual and strategic brilliance. For him to describe a subordinate as, quote, lovable character suggests something specific about how Mackensen presented himself. This social charm was something that would serve Mackensen throughout his career. Mackensen absorbed all this information from his mentors completely. In his campaigns, he gave his subordinate clear objectives and then stepped back, trusting them to execute rather than micromanaging every detail. Mackensen impressed Kaiser Wilhelm II, who ordered that Mackensen be given command from June 1893 of the 1st Life Hussar Regiment. This was an imperial appointment, not a routine promotion through the normal system, but a direct order from the Kaiser himself. Wilhelm II had come to the throne in 1888, and by 1893 he had been watching Mackensen for years and had formed a clear view. This was one of the finest cavalry officers in the German Empire, and he deserved command of the most prestigious Hussar regiment in existence, the 1st Life Hussar. They were not just symbolic cavalry regiment in Germany, it was one of the most historically significant military units in Europe. The first known military units to openly use a skull motif were the Prussian 1st and 2nd Life Hussar Regiments, both raised on August 9, 1741. For Mackensen to command this regiment was the fulfillment of everything he had reached for when he first enlisted as a volunteer in 1869. He started as a nobody in the 2nd Life Hussar. Now, a quarter century later, the Kaiser himself placed him in command. Mackensen became a la suite of the regiment when he left its command on the 27th of January in 1898. So he often wore the distinctive death's head uniform thereafter. The la suite distinction was an honor, and meant he remained permanently affiliated with the regiment even after leaving its command, entitled to wear its uniform for the rest of his life. And Mackensen did exactly that, right up until his death. Every time the elderly Mackensen appeared at events, it was in his black Hussar uniform. After this, then came the appointment that shocked even Mackensen himself. Mackensen was surprised by his next posting, as adjutant to Wilhelm II. He shadowed the Kaiser and met the high and mighty of Germany, the rest of Europe, and the Middle East. His sons were schooled with the Kaisers. The Kaiser's adjutant was not a secretary. He was the emperor's constant military companion, the man who was physically present at his side in virtually every official and many unofficial contexts. He organized the military dimensions of the imperial schedule, managed the flow of military correspondence and decisions, and accompanied the Kaiser on state visits and military reviews. He even served as an informal bridge between the emperor and the officer corps. Every Kaiser before Wilhelm II had appointed a nobleman to this position. The adjutant was part of the imperial household, a social as well as military appointment, and social conventions held that only men of aristocratic blood could inhabit that intimate space around the throne. Mackensen was the first man without noble birth ever to be given this role. And then a special moment came for Mackensen. Mackensen was ennobled on the Kaiser's 40th birthday, January 27, 1899, and officially became August von Mackensen. The date was chosen deliberately and meaningfully. January 27th was the Kaiser's birthday, one of the most significant dates in the imperial calendar. Wilhelm II was making a public statement about the relationship between them and about his personal regard for von Mackensen. It was a gift as much as a formal act, and his children could now inherit the noble distinction. He had permanent access to social spaces and institutions previously closed to commoners, and within the officer corps, the invisible barrier that had always existed between von Mackensen and the Junker officers around him were formally dissolved. When Kaiser Wilhelm II raised him to nobility, the newly created August von Mackensen chose, as his family motto, the simple theme of, quote, Memmi Mienishi, end quote. Recalling his humble origins, this choice of motto is one of the most psychologically revealing facts about von Mackensen's entire career. He could have chosen anything, something grand, something martial, something that emphasized his noble status. Instead, he chose a Latin phrase telling himself and the world never to forget where he came from. The farm in Saxony, the father who managed other men's land, the boy who had no von and no estate and no connection. This was a reminder to never become arrogant or ungrateful, which unfortunately happens to many people who gain power. By the end of the century, August von Mackensen was now 50 years old. He had spent 26 years in the peacetime army. He had been mentored by three of the most formidable military minds in Germany. He had commanded the most prestigious cavalry regiment in the empire, and he had served as the Kaiser's right-hand man, shadowing the emperor across Europe and the Middle East. He was also genuinely loved by the men under his command, in a way that purely intellectual or aristocratic officers often were not. His warmth, his physical courage, his commitment to looking after his soldiers' welfare, and his faith, all of these made him a figure his men would follow rather than merely obey. That quality of personal leadership, combined with his strategic education, was what made him so formidable when war would finally come. The 25 years between the Franco-Prussian War produced no battles, no dramatic moments, and no headlines. They were years of quiet, sustained, and disciplined professional development. The knowledge and capability in the crucible of the greatest war the world had ever seen produced a formidable field marshal. After completing his time as imperial adjutant in 1901, von Mackensen was given command of the newly created Life Hussar Brigade. He received command of this newly created Life Hussar Brigade from 1901 to 1903. A brigade in German military structure was a formation between a regiment and a division, typically consisting of two or more regiments under a single commander. The Life Hussar Brigade was specifically formed to group the two most prestigious Hussar regiments under unified command. Von Mackensen, who had served in the 2nd Life Hussar as a young volunteer, was a natural and obvious choice to command, the newly formed brigade that contained both. Brigade command was a different challenge from regimental command. As the regimental commander, you led roughly 800 to 1,000 men and could, in principle, know most of your officers personally. As a brigade commander, you led multiple regiments totaling several thousand men, and your job shifted decisively toward coordination, planning, and the management of subordinate commanders rather than direct personal leadership. It was the next rung on the ladder toward operational command, the ability to think not just about one unit, but about multiple units worked together. Von Mackensen brought to this command the full weight of his general staff training and his years as Schlieffen student. He ran exercises that were demanding and realistic. He cultivated the Auftrag tactic culture that Moltke and Schlieffen had taught him. From 1903 to 1908, he commanded the 36th Division in Danzig. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what a division was and what commanding one required. A division in the German army of this era was a formation of approximately 15,000 to 18,000 men. This included infantry, artillery, cavalry, engineers, signals, and supply troops, all integrated under a single command. It was a self-contained fighting force capable of independent operations. For von Mackensen, he was a cavalry officer and a brigade commander. His world had been characterized by mobility, reconnaissance, and the specific culture of the Hussar tradition. As a divisional commander, he was, for the first time, responsible for the combined arms warfare that would define the coming conflict, which was the careful integration of infantry, artillery, and cavalry into a coherent fighting system. He had studied this in theory for years on the general staff. Now he was doing it in practice, with real men and real equipment, and real consequences for any errors. Danzig was at this time one of the most strategically important cities in Germany. Situated on the Baltic coast at the mouth of the Vistula River, it was a major port, a significant industrial center, and a city that sat close to the Russian frontier. The 17th Army Corps, of which the 36th Division was a component, was specifically tasked with the defense of East Prussia against any potential Russian invasion. Von Mackensen threw himself into this command with intensity. The 5 years at Danzig saw him develop the operational thinking and leadership relationships that would directly carry over into the First World War. He worked with his staff hard, ran demanding exercises, and built a reputation as a commander who combined strategic intelligence with genuine care for the welfare of his men. It was a sense that von Mackensen expected the best from them because he truly believed they were capable of it. He also became genuinely connected to the city of Danzig itself. Von Mackensen was an honorary citizen of many cities, including Danzig. This honorary citizenship was not merely ceremonial. It reflected a real bond between the commanding general and the community he served. Von Mackensen understood that the German army did not exist in isolation from civilian life. The men of the 36th Division were Danzig men. They were merchants' sons, craftsmen's sons, and farmers' sons from the surrounding countryside. Their families lived in the city. The army and the community were intertwined, and von Mackensen navigated that relationship with the social intelligence he had developed over decades. But all was not well. In the middle of this professional productive years came a devastating personal blow. His wife died in 1905. Doris von Horn had been von Mackensen's companion for 26 years. She was a woman who had shared his entire rise from cavalry lieutenant to divisional commander. She had borne him 5 children, buried one of them in childhood, and supported him through the constant upheavals of a military career that moved the family from garrison to garrison across the German Empire. Her death at age 51 was not sudden. She had been ill for some time, but grief does not care about preparation. Von Mackensen's Lutheran faith was the anchor he clung to. Von Mackensen was not a man who expressed emotions publicly. The Prussian officer culture in which he had been formed regarded public displays of personal feeling as inappropriate. But his letters from this period reveal a man shattered by the loss of his wife and seeking consolation in scripture and prayer. He continued to command. The work did not stop, and von Mackensen was not the kind of man who allowed personal grief to compromise professional duty. But something shifted in him. He was now alone at 55, a widower, commanding a division in a Baltic port city while carrying a grief that had no professional outlet. 2 years after Dorsey's death, von Mackensen made a decision that raised eyebrows across German military and social circles. 2 years later, he married Leonie von der Ostren. Leonie came from an acceptable social background, and this marriage appears to have been genuine. Leonie was present at von Mackensen's side through everything that followed. She outlived him, dying in Germany that had changed almost beyond recognition. Her age caused some people to be suspicious of their marriage. She was 22, and he was 57. In this type of society, a widower generally marrying a woman young enough to be his daughter was at minimum unusual, and at maximum a source of scandal. The marriage also produced no children. Von Mackensen already had some, and presumably was not seeking to expand his family so much as seeking companionship for the difficult years ahead. The 17th Corps that von Mackensen had already commanded for 6 years prior to the outbreak of World War I encompassed a pair of divisions of 8 infantry regiments, 1 battalion of Jaegers, 3 regiments of cavalry hussars, the 4th Regiment of Mounted Rifles, 2 brigades of field artillery, engineer troops, and the aerial 17th Detachment for reconnaissance. 8 infantry regiments meant roughly 16,000 to 24,000 infantry soldiers. 3 regiments of cavalry hussars meant mobile reconnaissance capability. The field artillery meant dozens of guns capable of delivering devastating firepower. The headquarters was in Danzig initially, but later relocated to Darkmenen in East Prussia, directly on the border region that faced the Russian Empire. This was not a comfortable rear area posting. Von Mackensen was positioned on the frontier of the German Empire, responsible for the defense of the territory that faced the most immediate threat of Russian invasion. Every exercise, every mobilization plan, every map study in those 6 years was oriented around one essential question. When the Russians come, how do we stop them? He ran his corps with the same demanding standards he had applied to every previous command. Officers who served under him during this period recalled a commanding general who seemed to have the energy of a man 20 years younger, who appeared at dawn, inspections, and late-night planning sessions with equal vigor. He also continued the intellectual development that had characterized his entire career. He studied the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 intensively, a conflict that had revealed, for those willing to see it, the devastating power of modern artillery and machine guns against massed infantry, the importance of field fortifications, and the enormous logistical challenges of sustained modern warfare. Many European generals dismissed the lessons of that distant conflict as irrelevant to European conditions. Von Mackensen did not. He incorporated those lessons into his training and planning, preparing his corps for a kind of war that differed fundamentally from the rapid cavalry and infantry clashes of 1870. Then the Kaiser gave von Mackensen one of the most delicate assignments of his entire career. The Crown Prince was placed under his command, and the Kaiser asked von Mackensen to keep an eye on the young man and to teach him to ride properly. Crown Prince Wilhelm was the heir to the German throne and one of the most complicated young men in the empire. He became Crown Prince at the age of 6 in 1888 when his grandfather Frederick III died, and his father became emperor. He was Crown Prince for 30 years until his father's abdication. The relationship between Kaiser Wilhelm II and his son was unstable. Wilhelm II regarded his eldest son with contempt, mainly because of his many affairs with women. The Crown Prince became noted for his public criticism of his father's politics. Now von Mackensen, who had been tutoring members of the Hohenzollern family in military skills, was asked to take their heir to the throne under his wing and teach him not just to ride, but to function as a military officer with some semblance of professional credibility. The Crown Prince joined the 1st Life Hussar Regiment, No. 1, in Danzig on the 15th of September, serving under a General August von Mackensen until 1913, a role that honed his tactical oversight in a cavalry unit known for its elite status. Promoted to colonel on 27th of January 1913, he then joined the Great General Staff in Berlin in December 1913. Von Mackensen's handling of this assignment reveals enormous diplomatic skill. He had to manage several competing imperatives simultaneously. He was supposed to give the Crown Prince genuine military education, not simply flatter him or treat him as an ornament, but he could also not humiliate the heir to the throne in front of his junior officers. He had to maintain the discipline and the standards of the 1st Life Hussars, while making space for a young prince who had never had to meet real standards in his life. And he had to do all of this without antagonizing either the Kaiser, who was watching from Berlin, or the Crown Prince himself, who had enough influence to cause serious professional damage to anyone who crossed him. By all accounts, von Mackensen managed it with grace. He treated the Crown Prince with respect and genuine care, while holding him to real, if appropriately adjusted, military standards. The Crown Prince's horsemanship under Mackensen improved. His understanding of military organization developed. While von Mackensen commanded his corps and tutored the Crown Prince in Danzig, the world outside was undergoing a series of crises. Europe between 1908 and 1914 experienced a series of escalating international crises that each time brought the great powers to the edge of war, and each time they pulled back, but left the diplomatic architecture more fragile than before. To name a few, we have the Bosnian crisis of 1908, when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina over Russian protest, the Moroccan crisis of 1905 and 1911, when Germany challenged French colonial expansion in North Africa and found itself outmaneuvered diplomatically, the Balkan Wars of 1912, which destroyed the Ottoman Empire's European possessions and left the great power Balkan clients armed, victorious, and dangerously emboldened. Each crisis was resolved without general war, but each resolution left behind more bitterness than before. In December 1911, Moltke lectured the General Staff, quote, "All are preparing themselves for the great war, which we'll all sooner or later expect." End quote. The chief of the German General Staff was telling his officers that the general European war was not a possibility, but a certainty. The only question was where and when. In Danzig, von Mackensen heard this, and had been preparing for 6 years. His corps was ready at a moment's notice. The mobilization plans were refined. The railway schedules were memorized. The deployment routes were walked and ridden and studied until every senior officer knew them without a map. In 1908, Wilhelm II caused a major fervor in Germany when, after a visit to England, he gave an interview to the Daily Telegraph, making comments that alienated France, Russia, and Japan. The Kaiser's erratic diplomacy was systematically destroying the international goodwill that Bismarck had painstakingly constructed and maintained. Germany was becoming isolated, surrounded by an entente of France, Russia, and Britain that the Schlieffen Plan had been designed to defeat militarily before it could be brought fully to bear. Von Mackensen watched all this from Danzig with the clarity of a man who understood exactly what it meant in military terms. More enemies, fewer allies, and a window of opportunity that was narrowing as Russian industrial and military power grew with each passing year. The German military consensus by 1913 was increasingly that if war was coming, it was better sooner than later, before Russia completed its modernization of its army and railway network that was scheduled for 1917. His relationship with his men extended beyond mere professionalism. It was said of him, quote, "He was bold in front of the enemy and only feared God." End quote. That combination was the foundation of a leadership presence that the men instinctively trusted. He commanded through the specific kind of personal magnetism that comes from being genuinely unafraid, genuinely competent, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of those you lead. By 1914, he was 64 years old, and contemporaries consistently noted that he appeared significantly younger. But then the infamous day would come. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. In the world that von Mackensen had spent 45 years preparing to defend, began to come apart in ways that even his most intensive planning had not fully anticipated. The July crisis that followed the assassination is one of the most studied and debated sequences of events in modern history. In the space of 5 weeks, a regional political crisis transformed into a general European war. The alliance system that had been designed to deter war instead mechanically generated it. Each power's mobilization plans required action at specific timings that could not be easily modified. For example, once Russia began to mobilize, Germany felt compelled to mobilize as well, which triggered France to mobilize. The war that everyone had been preparing for finally arrived before anyone had quite intended it to start. In Danzig, von Mackensen received the mobilization order with the professional readiness of a man who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 6 years. The machinery he had built and maintained and rehearsed clicked into motion with the precision of a well-maintained instrument. At the outbreak of war, von Mackensen commanded the 17th Army Corps, which became part of the German 8th Army in East Prussia, under General Maximilian von Pritzwitz, and then 21 days later, under General Paul von Hindenburg. Von Mackensen had his corps moving out on a 24-kilometer march to the Romanty River within 55 minutes of receiving his orders on the afternoon of August 19, 1914. After the Imperial Russian Army had invaded East Prussia, think about the time, 50 minutes, a corps of 35,000 men moving in coordinated formation within 50 minutes of receiving orders. That is the product of 6 years of meticulous preparation, relentless drilling, and the cultivation of a staff and subordinate commander team that knew exactly what to do and how to do it. Von Mackensen was going to war for the second time in his life. And this time, unlike 1870, it would not be over in a year. It would consume everything. When war was declared in late July and early August, the German military machine activated the modified Schlieffen Plan in the west. Roughly 1.5 million soldiers were moving through Belgium into France. The entire logic of the German war plan depended on this entire campaign being over within 6 weeks. With France defeated, the French army destroyed or rendered incapable of further resistance. Only then could Germany transfer its victorious armies east to deal with the Russians. The Eastern Front defense was therefore small. The Russian invasion of East Prussia was an attempt to focus the Imperial German Army on the Eastern Front and force Germany to fight a two-front war. The German deployment on the outbreak of the war left only the 10 divisions of the German Eighth Army under General von Preusswitz in East Prussia. 10 divisions to hold an enormous frontier against the Russian Empire, the largest nation on earth, with a population of 170 million people, and the capacity to field armies of enormous sizes. To ease the pressure on France, the Russian commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nicholas, had urged his First and Second Armies to invade East Prussia before they could have achieved full readiness. This decision by Grand Duke Nicholas to attack before full mobilization was complete was driven entirely by French pressure. France was facing the full weight of the Schlieffen Plan crashing through Belgium. French politicians and generals were begging Russia to do anything to draw German forces away from the Western campaign. At the request of France, and according to the Franco-Russian Military Convention of 1892, even before the end of the mobilization and deployment of its army, the Russian command decided to go into action to prevent the offensive of the main forces of Germany against France. This premature advance would ultimately doom the Russian effort, but in the short term it created a crisis. The Russians were coming faster than the Schlieffen Plan had assumed, with more force than the small German Eighth Army was designed to handle. And they were doing it so precisely when every German soldier in the West was needed for the decisive campaign in France. To fully understand what Mackensen faced, you need to understand the two Russian armies advancing into East Prussia. The two armies were formed as a part of the Russian Northwestern Front, the First Army under General Paul von Rennenkampf and the Second Army under General Alexander Samsonov. The plan was a classic pincer movement, Rennenkampf advancing from northeastern toward Königsberg, Samsonov sweeping from the south, the two armies converging on the German Eighth Army from two different directions and destroying it between them. On paper, it was a sound operational concept. If both armies moved in coordination, maintaining communication, and adjusting their advances to support each other, the German Eighth Army would face enemies on two sides, simultaneously, with no room to maneuver. There was, however, a critical human factor undermining this plan before it even began. Rennenkampf and Samsonov hated each other. Their animosity dated to the Russo-Japanese War. In a campaign that required perfect coordination between two armies, their commanders would prove incapable of cooperating. The supply situation of the Russian armies was already catastrophic before a shot was fired. Russian supply trains depended on horse-drawn vehicles, and in these sandy wastes, everything moved at a snail's pace, so the Russians could not requisition food and fodder from the usual sources. By the time the Second Army crossed the German border, they had already been on march for 9 days. They were approaching exhaustion. Mobilization had been so hastily that troops even lacked field bakeries. The German Eighth Army that von Mackensen, 17th Corps belonged to, was commanded by General von Preusswitz, a man whose behavior during the coming crisis would become one of the most studied examples of command failure in the entire First World War. Preusswitz's orders were clear. His German Eighth Army was to remain in positions in East Prussia without attempting any offensive action. In addition, should the Russians increase their pressure, he was authorized to fall back as far as the Vistula River, abandoning eastern Prussia. This was a difficult set of orders to execute psychologically. The Vistula line was far to the west of the current German position. Withdrawing to it would mean abandoning the ancient Prussian heartland to Russian occupation. The symbolic and emotional weight of that retreat would have been almost unbearable for Prussian officers and men, many of whom came from East Prussian families. But strategically, it was defensible, a shorter, stronger line to hold while the West was decided. The problem was Preusswitz. He was a man who had reached his level of command through seniority and social position, rather than demonstrated operational success. The first contact between the Russian and German armies came on August 17th at Stalopolen, a small town near the Russian border. This engagement was started not by Preusswitz, but one of its corps commanders, General Hermann von Francois, acting entirely on his own initiative against explicit orders. By the time he withdrew to Gumbinnen after this battle, his corps had inflicted 5,000 casualties and managed to capture about 3,000 Russian prisoners. It was a tactical success, but Francois had acted without orders, exposed his corps to the risk of being cut off if Russian forces outflanked him, and demonstrated a pattern of command insubordination that would continue throughout the coming campaign, sometimes with brilliant results, and sometimes with heavy consequences. For von Mackensen, this opening episode was instructive. He knew Francois, he understood exactly the temperament at work, but there was a difference between individual bravery and a corps commander unilaterally deciding to attack when the army commander had ordered defensive positions. This was the tension between initiative and coordination. After Staloponen, the Russian First Army continued its advance westward, pushing into East Prussia. Prudwitz now faced a decision. His orders said to hold defensive positions, and if necessary withdraw, but his First Corps commander had just demonstrated that aggressive action could achieve results, and the Russian advance was threatening to push deep into East Prussian territory. Prudwitz made the decision to attack. It was the right instinct, but wrong execution, for a reason that goes to the heart of what happened at Gumbinnen: timing and coordination. The German offensive was launched somewhat in haste, certainly before two of his corps were in a state of readiness. General von Mackensen and General von Belau did not achieve a full state of readiness until some 4 to 8 hours after Francois had commenced the attack in the north. This gap was the seed of the disaster. In a coordinated attack, all three corps should have struck simultaneously, preventing the Russian army from concentrating against any one of them. Instead, Francois attacked alone, and von Mackensen could not begin until 8 a.m., and Belau not until noon. At 4 a.m., First Corps attacked the Russian 28th Division, which put up artillery defense. However, the Russians were always lacking in supplies, and they soon expanded their artillery ammunition. This left them at the mercy of the German artillery, and they were forced to retreat 8 kilometers in the early afternoon. The lines were then stabilized when the Russian 29th Division arrived, and the battle turned into a stalemate. By 8 a.m., Mackensen's 17th Corps was ready and attacked. He was positioned in the center of the German line, between Francois to the north and Belau to the south. His corps comprised roughly 35,000 men, 2 full divisions. What von Mackensen encountered when his corps made contact with the Russian line was something he had not fully anticipated, and this requires careful explanation. The General Staff had extensively studied the Russian army as revealed by the Russo-Japanese War. The conclusions drawn from that war were that Russian military had fundamental weakness in organization, supply, leadership, and communication that would make it manageable even for a numerically inferior German force. These conclusions were partially correct, but dangerously incomplete. Yes, the Russian army had serious weakness in all those areas, but it also had something the German analysis underweighted: the Russian soldier's physical endurance. His tolerance for hardship and his ability to defend a position was stubborn and almost suicidal determination. Von Mackensen's 17th Corps was less fortunate. It arrived at Gumbinnen ahead of von Belau's corps and was immediately committed to the battle. Where a local Russian advantage and artillery first halted the advance, the Russian artillery von Mackensen ran into was the Russian Third Corps under General Panchin, and it was significantly stronger in guns than the German intelligence assessments had suggested. The German infantry advancing across the open East Prussian landscape, which was flat ground with limited cover, fields of standing crops, and scattered farmhouses, were walking into a wall of artillery fire that shattered their formations. Companies and battalions that had drilled and trained for years were torn apart in minutes. Officers were killed, and units lost cohesion. Then something happened that transformed the situation into a crisis. The Russian 20th Corps, under General Nikolai Panchin, launched vigorous counterattacks in the afternoon, deploying fresh reserves to regain momentum. These successful assaults recaptured the town of Goldlap, which had briefly fallen to German advances earlier in the day, and began enveloping the exposed flanks of the German 17th Corps commanded by von Mackensen. The Russian counterattack hit 17th Corps from the flank, the most dangerous direction from which an attack can come. Because men in column or line are most vulnerable to fire from the side, the corps began to come apart, and the retreat spread. Soldiers who had been fighting with discipline and order began to fall back faster and faster until it became something called a rout, where units could no longer hold their position and retreat. This was the moment of von Mackensen's first great test and great failure. His 17th Corps broke under the combined pressure of Russian artillery and flanking counterattack. The 3 German corps fought separately against powerful, if ineffective, employed Russian forces. Seeing how badly they were outnumbered and outgunned, The German 17th Corps began to withdraw at the end of the day. The other two corps, including Francois' First Corps, had little choice but to follow suit, leaving more than 6,000 German prisoners in Russian hands. As von Mackensen commented, quote, I had the strong impression that my corps had not been outfought, nor had it suffered such heavy losses. In complete, calm, and good order, and without any interference by the enemy, it made its withdrawal. End quote. He was saying his corps was not destroyed. It withdrew in order, and the enemy did not pursue effectively. He's defending his men, but he's not pretending a withdrawal was a victory. The 17th Corps had broken and retreated, and von Mackensen knew it. Prittwitz was now seeing his army in retreat, and receiving alarming intelligence about the position of Samsonov's Second Army advancing from the south. He completely lost his nerve, and Prittwitz panicked. His units were in disarray, and he expected Rennenkampf to pursue with the utmost vigor. He also had no clear idea of where Samson's Second Army was. He therefore feared that he might be encircled and destroyed by a much larger Russian force. He designed an even more ambitious retreat, proposing to retreat behind the Vistula River. Prittwitz's panic affected Moltke, who feared that Berlin itself could not be threatened by the advancing Russians. On the 21st of August, Moltke decided to replace Prittwitz and his chief of staff, Georg von Waldersee. Then Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff assumed their roles on the 22nd. In the space of 2 days, von Mackensen's corps had been defeated in battle, and their army commander panicked and was replaced. This was making a bad situation even worse. So the defeat directly contributed to the weakening of the Schlieffen Plan in the west. The two men arrived at 8th Army headquarters on August 23rd and found that much of the essential thinking for the response to the situation had already been worked out by a staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Max Hoffmann, who would remain one of the unsung heroes of the entire war. Hoffmann was Prittwitz's deputy chief of operations, a mid-ranking staff officer who served as an observer with the Japanese army during the Russo-Japanese War, and had developed an intimate knowledge of how the Russian army actually worked. He knew its strength and its weaknesses. He also knew its communication failures, and he knew something specific about the commanders, that Rennenkampf and Samsonov hated each other. Hoffmann proposed a plan whereby cavalry troops would be deployed as a screen at Vistula, the intention being to confuse Rennenkampf, who held a deep personal vendetta with Samsonov, and so would be disinclined to come to his aid if he had a justifiable cause not to. The plan Hoffmann devised, and both Ludendorff and Hindenburg confirmed, was bold. Francois' First Corps were transported over 100 miles by railroad to the far southwest to meet the left wing of Samsonov's Second Army. Hindenburg's remaining two corps under von Mackensen and Belau were to await orders to move south by foot, so as to confront Samsonov's right wing. A 4th Garrison Corps was ordered to remain near the Vistula to meet Samsonov as his army moved north. The trap was being set. It was a big gamble, and it worked because of two things: Russian communication failures and the personal antagonism between Rennenkampf and Samsonov. Ludendorff also learned at this point that a second intercept of Samsonov's own plans made it clear that he would continue his march northwest. Having concluded that the Germans would continue to retreat, the Russians were broadcasting their operation orders in plain language by wireless telegraph. The Germans were reading them in real time. Hindenburg and Ludendorff knew exactly where Samsonov's army was, where it was going, how fast it was moving, and what it intended to do, because Samsonov was telling them inadvertently in every message he sent. Both Hindenburg and Ludendorff were skeptical that these intercepts were real after all. What commander would be stupid enough to transmit his orders that clear, let alone two of them? Nevertheless, they were eventually convinced they were indeed real, and the plans were put into action. This was an extraordinary intelligence windfall that no amount of planning could have guaranteed. The German commanders knew the enemy's intentions with certainty. Now von Mackensen received his orders. His 17th Corps was to march south and attack the right flank of Samsonov's Second Army. This was a redemption moment, and von Mackensen grabbed it immediately. The march itself was a feat of physical endurance. 17th Corps and 1st Reserve Corps would march towards the left of 20th Corps. This was not a short distance. The corps were moving from its position near Gannenben and northwest southward to reach Samsonov's right flank. The men who had been in combat 4 days earlier were now marching hard, carrying their equipment, and keeping pace with a timetable that left no room for rest. The Masurian Lake District through which they were moving was one of the most challenging places of terrain in Central Europe for military operations. The region was characterized by complex networks of lakes, some enormous connected by narrow strips of land, marshy ground, defense forts, and sandy roads that became mud and rain. Navigation required real skill, supply was difficult, and artillery movement was complicated by the terrain. A wrong turn could cost hours that could not be recovered. Von Mackensen drove his corps hard, and drove himself harder. The Battle of Tannenberg was not a single day's fighting. It was a 4-day operational sequence that progressively tightened a noose around the Russian Second Army until it collapsed completely. On August 26th, the German forces made their first coordinated move against Samsonov's army. Francois's First Corps attacked from the west and south against Samsonov's left flank. Von Mackensen's 20th Corps attacked from the north and northeast against Samsonov's right flank. The 20th Corps, under Schultz, held the German center, pitting Samsonov's main body in place. The Russian right wing, separated from the Russian center, came into contact with von Mackensen's 20th Corps. The Russian right wing was badly beaten and thrown into headlong retreat southward towards Olsztyn and Wallen, more than 20 miles away. Some Russian soldiers were trapped with their backs to the lake and then drowned. The confusion of a broken unit in retreat through unfamiliar terrain at night or in poor visibility was absolute. The entire command structure of the Russian right wing was disintegrating. Von Mackensen's corps, which had broken 6 days earlier, was now the hammering drive on one side of the encirclement, pushing the Russian right wing back faster than it could reorganize. And on August 27th, Francois continued his attack on the Russian left, pushing them towards Niedenberg and threatening to close the southern end of the encirclement. Von Mackensen's corps continued pursuing the retreating Russian right wing, preventing it from recovering cohesion or linking up with the Russian center. On the same day, Francois attacked the Russian left near Uzdena. Exhausted and starving, Samsonov's left fell back in disorder. By nightfall, the Russian Second Army's wings were broken and in retreat. The only thing left to do was try to extricate his center. Yet Samsonov unexpectedly ordered his center to push forward, virtually assuring that it would be encircled and trapped. Samsonov's decision to order his center to advance even as his flanks collapsed is one of the most baffling command decisions of the entire war. It can only be explained by the catastrophic state of his communications. He simply did not know what was happening on his flanks, because the messages weren't reaching him, or were reaching him hours late and were out of date. The Russian army's communication failures, which had already handed the German operational intelligence, were now blinding their own commanders to the disaster closing around him. Von Mackensen's corps continued pursuing the retreating Russians, so one half of the German encirclement was complete by the end of the day. As Ludendorff wrote, quote, "The enemy front seemed to be breaking up," end quote. Then came the moment that completed the trap. Disastrously for Samsonov, Hoffmann and Ludendorff intercepted Jelinski's unciphered order to run in camp. He promptly dispatched Bilal from Biskopsburg to rejoin the German center and sent von Mackensen south to meet up with General Francois, where they joined in Williamburg, south of Biskopsburg. Samsonov was by now surrounded. The link-up at Williamburg was the moment the trap closed completely. Francois's corps from the west and Mackensen's corps from the north met south of the Russian army. The circle was complete. Samsonov's Second Army was encircled, capturing 122,000 troops and 500 guns, while the Germans only lost 15,000 men. Inside the encirclement, the scenes were almost indescribable horror. The Russian soldiers trapped in what the Germans called the Kessel were being systematically compressed into a smaller and smaller area, pounded by artillery from all sides. The troops from the Russian Second Army center, who were retreating south, ran into a German defensive line. Those Russians who tried to break through by dashing across open fields heavy with crops were mowed down. They were in a cauldron centered at Frauenau, west of Tannenberg. Many surrendered. Samsonov himself entered the encirclement to rally his troops. He wandered with a small group of staff officers through the forest, lost, increasingly desperate, and fully aware of the catastrophe he had just watched. General Samsonov disappeared on the night of August 29th and is thought to have committed suicide in the darkness of a Polish forest, but this isn't confirmed. The war had just started, and the scale of German victory was almost incomprehensible. The Russian Second Army had been destroyed. The losses tell only part of the story. Many more Russian soldiers died of exhaustion, starvation, and exposure in the forest of the encirclement. The Second Army simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. Hindenburg named the battle Tannenberg, Germany, redeeming a medieval defeat 5 centuries later. Tannenberg was over, but Rennenkampf's First Army was still in East Prussia. Now Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and Hoffmann turned the entire 8th Army north and northeast to deal with it. Following a great victory, they aimed to exploit their momentum by advancing northeast to encircle the Russian. The German First Corps, under General Hermann von Francois initiated attacks on the positions held by Russian General Rennenkampf on September 7th. Mackensen's corps participated in this campaign as well, advancing against Rennenkampf's army as part of the encirclement attempt. The battle was not another Tannenberg. Rennenkampf reorganized the danger in time in order to withdraw before the encirclement could close completely. But the result was still a German success. Although the Germans didn't achieve their goal, the campaign resulted in significant casualties for the Russians, with around 227,000 soldiers being lost, while the Germans received relatively lighter losses of about 30,000 men. By early November, the Russian High Command had assembled approximately 2 million soldiers across 9 armies in a Russian-controlled Poland. Grand Duke Nicholas favored a plan to invade Silesia. Losing Silesia would be catastrophic. The Germans knew this plan, because once again, the Russians were transmitting their operation orders in open air. The German force surrounding Loditz grew to 15 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions, facing 24 Russian infantry divisions and 8 cavalry divisions. The Germans were outnumbered significantly in both infantry and cavalry. Hindenburg and Ludendorff made the same fundamental decision they had made before Tannenberg. Rather than meet the attack head-on, seize the initiative by striking first where the enemy was most vulnerable. They did this by shifting their 9th Army north by railway to south of the German fortress at Thorn, where they were reinforced with 2 corps transferred from 8th Army. This transfer was a logistical achievement of the First Order. In 10 days, 9th Army was moved north by running 80 trains every day. The operational objective was precise. The 9th Army would then attack the Russian right flank, cutting off Loditz from Warsaw and eliminating any troops. The concept was another encirclement, the same idea that had worked at Tannenberg. Strike between the Russian 1st and 2nd Armies, drive them apart, encircle the 2nd Army against the city of Loditz and destroy it. The Russians were still unaware of the German force attacking them, as they started their invasion of Silesia. On the 11th of November, von Mackensen's German 9th Army and the 25th Reserve Corps struck at the 5th Siberian Army Corps of Rennenkampf's 1st Army, located near Waltawik on the left bank of the Vistula. Before they could prepare defense positions, the German 20th Corps advanced so as to attack the 5th Siberian Army Corps' flanks. On that same day, von Mackensen's army struck one of the corps of Rennenkampf's 1st Army, which was posted south of the Vistula, and routed it, capturing around 12,000 prisoners. The rout of the Siberian Corps had immediately operational consequences that von Mackensen had planned for. The rout left a gap between the 1st Russian Army and 2nd one, and the two forces lost contact with one another. The gap between the two armies was now open and widening. Von Mackensen drove his forces through this gap with maximum speed. On the 14th of November, von Mackensen ordered his entire German army to advance, with his 11th Corps attacking the Russians' 23rd Army Corps' northern flank, his 27th and 20th Corps engaging the Russian 2nd Army Corps, and his 1st Reserve Corps was to capture Lowitz, while containing the 6th Siberian Army Corps. This was simultaneously putting pressure on multiple points. Over 5 days of continuous advance, von Mackensen pushed the dispersed Russian 1st Army back 50 miles while taking 12,000 prisoners, drove between it and the Russian 2nd Army, and turned the right flank of the 2nd Army, pressing it back on 3 sides against the city of Loditz. The Grand Duke Nicholas made a decision that saved the Russian 2nd Army. On November 16th, he ordered the Russian 5th Army to abandon the proposed offensive into Silesia and to move northward towards Loditz. The timing was critical. Von Mackensen's 9th Army had been advancing for 7 days in freezing conditions, fighting constantly and extending its supply lines with every mile of progress. His corps was spread across a wide front, trying to complete the encirclement. When the 5th Army hit his exposed right flank on November 18th, the German formation most directly in its path was the 25th Corps, the far right wing of the entire army. The formation that had been pushing hardest to complete the encirclement, the 25th Reserve Corps, suddenly found itself not encircling the enemy, but being encircled. Von Mackensen's response to this crisis reveals the essential quality of his command. He did not panic. He made 2 clear simultaneous decisions. Von Mackensen stopped attacking towards Loditz, turning to help extract them. He halted the entire offensive and redirected his forces to rescue the trapped corps. At the same moment, Schäfer Boyadel, inside the encirclement, made his own decision. Rather than surrender, or simply hold defensively and wait to be rescued, he attacked outward. In a surprise maneuver, the advanced units of the 25th Corps suddenly turned and broke through the Russian lines. The encircled Germans broke out of the Russian encirclement, while capturing 16,000 Russian prisoners in the process. With the 25th Reserve Corps extracted, von Mackensen received reinforcements and resumed offensive operation towards Loditz itself. Von Mackensen remained determined to take Loditz. After a week of costly attacks by the Germans convinced Russian Supreme Leader Grand Duke Nicholas that the city could not be held, on the 6th of December, the Russians evacuated Lodz and much of western Poland. They abandoned their plans for an invasion of Silesia and would never threaten Germany's heartland during the war. German forces, on the other hand, would occupy Lodz for the duration. By mid-September 1914, 6 weeks after the war began, East Prussia had been cleared of Russian forces. The German Eighth Army had transformed itself from the retreating formation early in the war into the victorious force of Tannenberg, and von Mackensen had been part of it all: its strength, its weaknesses, its command failures, and its capability to absorb hardship. Meanwhile, in the west, the Schlieffen Plan had failed. The Marne had stopped the German advance in September, and both sides had raced northward in a series of maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea, each trying to outflank the other's open northern wing. By November 1914, the race had ended, with both sides digging in from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a continuous line of trenches roughly 450 miles long. The war of movement in the west was now over. Both sides were now burrowed in the earth, protected by barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery. Every attempt to break the deadlock had produced catastrophic casualties for the attacker with minimal territorial gain. But in the east, the situation was more fluid, but deeply problematic for the Central Powers in a different way. Having suffered severe losses during the battles in summer and autumn and the Carpathian Winter War of 1915, the military forces of the Habsburg Empire had been weakened considerably and were expected to collapse under the next attack. Moreover, large parts of the crown lands of Galicia and Balkanava had fallen into Russian hands following the retreat of the Austro-Hungarian forces in summer of 1914, a loss that had severely damaged the reputation of the Habsburg monarchy. While Germany had been winning in the east, its ally Austria-Hungary had been experiencing a sequence of disasters in Galicia that called into question whether the dual monarchy could survive as a military partner at all. The German leadership understood this political arithmetic clearly. A decisive military victory on the Eastern Front was needed not just to save Austria-Hungary militarily, but to prevent the diplomatic catastrophe of two additional enemies, Italy and Romania, from joining the war against them. The German chief of the General Staff since September 1914 was Erich von Falkenhayn. He believed the war could not be won decisively, and that Germany needed to find a negotiated peace, a view that put him in constant conflict with Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who believed in pursuing maximum military objectives in the east. Having decided on a Galician offensive to turn the tide, now Falkenhayn had to build the new instrument for it. He concentrated his resources on a new 11th Army under August von Meck in northern Galicia. This was not simply a matter of assigning existing units. A new army had to be created from scratch. 8 German divisions received orders to move secretly from the western to the eastern front. The secrecy of this transfer was critical. If the Russians discovered that a new German army was concentrated in Galicia, they would reinforce the threatened sector. Eliminating the advantage of surprise that was central to the plan's success. To prevent spying, the local inhabitants were moved out of the build-up area. Entire villages were cleared of their civilian populations. Soldiers were forbidden to write home about their location. Trade movements happened at night. Supply columns moved under cover of darkness. It was an extraordinary logistical and counterintelligence operation, conducted over several weeks, involving hundreds of thousands of men, tons of equipment, and hundreds of artillery pieces. All moved without the Russian intelligence network detecting what was happening. The fact that the concentration remained secret until the last moment is itself a tribute to the German staff work. The relationship between von Mackensen and Hans von Siegt became one of the most effective command partnerships of the entire war. Understanding precisely why it worked requires understanding what each man brought and what each man lacked. In March 1915, he was transferred to the Eastern Front to serve as the Chief of Staff to General von Mackensen of the 11th Army. He played a major role in the planning and execution of Mackensen's highly successful campaigns. A saying spread throughout the German army that captured the partnership perfectly. Quote, "Where von Mackensen is, Siegt is. Where Siegt is, victory is." End quote. The selection of the specific breakthrough point between Gorlice and Tarnow was not arbitrary. It reflected a careful analysis by Siegt and Falkenhayn of the entire Galician front, identifying the specific sector where the combination of Russian weaknesses, terrain advantages, and operational opportunity was most favorable. Gorlice was a small Galician town in the foothills north of the Carpathians, Tarnow was a larger city to the northwest, on the Dunajec River. The sector between them lay in what military geographers called the gap between the Vistula River to the north and the Carpathian Mountains to the south, a corridor of relatively open ground through which large formations could maneuver and advance. The German plan was for a simple frontal assault, supported by heavy artillery bombardment. It was thus very different from the more ambitious plans for envelopments and double envelopments that had previously dominated German thinking. It was a type of attack that would have failed on the Western Front, but the Russian lines between Galicia and Tarnow were much weaker than the French or British lines in the west. The Russian High Command had concentrated most of its available reserves in the Carpathian for the offense against Hungary, that it was still trying to press forward. The troops defending the Gorlice-Tarnow sector were already deployed and could not easily be reinforced without disrupting the Carpathian operation. The Russian defenders of the Gorlice-Tarnow sector had essentially 3 operational heavy guns to defend against the most concentrated artillery bombardment the Eastern Front had ever seen. Von Mackensen had 10 infantry and 1 cavalry division along the 42-kilometer length of the breakthrough sector, with 126,000 men, 457 light guns, 159 heavy pieces, and 96 mortars. Compare those numbers to what they faced them, they would concentrate overwhelming firepower on the narrowest possible front, so that the defenders had no possibility of resistance, no matter how bravely they fought. The total artillery assembled for the operation across all formations was even larger. The offensive involved approximately 220,000 troops from the German 11th Army and the Austro-Hungarian 4th Army, supported by over 900 artillery pieces, targeted a 30-mile front. Von Mackensen viewed securing a breakthrough as the first phase of an operation, which would lead then to a Russian retreat from the Dukala Pass and their position north of the Vistula. He was not merely trying to break through the Russian line. Any competent commander could identify that as a tactical objective. He was planning what came after, the exploitation of the breakthrough to force a Russian withdrawal from the entire Carpathian position, threatening to encircle every Russian soldier south of the Vistula. During the attack, each unit was to draw upon its own reserves to keep the momentum of the attack and was to drive forward regardless of progress by its neighbors. Von Mackensen and Sieg expected these attacks to be mutually supporting, as they would keep the Russians off balance. At 6 a.m. on May 2nd, more than 900 guns opened fire simultaneously on the Russian position between Gorlice and Tarnow. There is no way to fully convey in words what this sounded like and felt like. The sound of 900 heavy and field guns firing in close succession was not a noise in any ordinary sense. Some Russian units tried to hold their positions under the fire. The extraordinary stoicism of the Russian soldier was real and should not be understated. But there was nothing a man could do, however brave, against a shell landing on top of him. The bombardment continued for 4 hours. At 10 a.m., the first wave of 30,000 German and Austro-Hungarian infantry attacked, and by the end of the day, they had captured the Russian first and second lines. By the evening of May 2nd, the troops of the Central Powers had advanced more than 10 kilometers into the enemy's zone of defense, while the Russians were struggling to rally scattered troops, bring up reinforcements, and reestablish a line of defense. Now the race began. The Germans were driving into Russian territory. The Russian command was trying desperately to form a new defensive line before the Germans reached it. The question now was whether Russian reserves could arrive and deploy faster than German infantry could advance. Sieg's answer to this question was embedded in the attack orders, which said to keep going, never consolidate prematurely, and pour reserves through every gap. All efforts proved futile as German and Austro-Hungarian troops kept advancing, while arriving Russian reinforcements were rushed into battle and consequently often isolated, outflanked, and defeated. Within only 8 days, the Third Army was almost completely destroyed, forcing the Russian High Command to order a general retreat to a new defensive line along the River San. The speed of its destruction shocked the Russian High Command. They had expected to lose ground, but they had not expected one of their main armies to simply disintegrate. 445,000 prisoners in roughly 2 months of the extended campaign, nearly 500,000 Russian soldiers captured, was collapsing psychologically in ways that produced mass surrenders rather than fighting withdrawals. Von Mackensen forces reached the San River, a significant water obstacle running north to south through Galicia. A less aggressive commander might have halted here, consolidated the enormous gains of the first phase, resupplied his troops, rebuilt his artillery, and then planned a second phase. But von Mackensen had other plans. By May 10th, the Russians had retreated beyond the river, which was crossed by Austro-Hungarian forces a week later. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers then surrendered. Then the offensive continued to expand. Russian counterattacks failed. On the 3rd of June, Przemysl was retaken by Austria-Hungary. Conrad's disastrous winter campaign in the Carpathian had failed to relieve it. Von Mackensen's offensive recovered it in 3 weeks. The Russian retreat of the Third Army now forced armies on either side of it to pull back to avoid being encircled. And then the Russian High Command ordered the complete withdrawal of all Russian forces from Galicia on June 21st. By that date, which marked the official end of the Galicia-Torno campaign, about 100,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded in action, and another 250,000 captured. Their Galicia-Torno breakthrough did not stop with the recapture of Galicia. It was the trigger of what became known as the, quote, Great Retreat. The withdrawal of Russian forces from virtually all the territory they had occupied in Poland, Galicia, and the Baltic provinces. The stalemate reached at the end of 1914 was broken by this campaign. Now the threat to Hungary was eliminated. The Russian forces that had been pressing through the Carpathian passes were now in full retreat. This circumstance proved crucial for Austria-Hungary when Italy declared war on May 1915. Since the Russian army was in chaos at the time, the Habsburg monarchy could transfer a considerable number of troops from the Eastern Front to the new theater of war, where they managed to stop the Italian attacks. The land link-up with the Ottoman Empire was established as German and Austro-Hungarian forces pushed eastward and eventually drove through Serbia in the autumn of 1915, opening the direct rail connection to Constantinople. For this campaign, von Mackensen received German military decoration, as well as a promotion in command authority. From commanding the 11th Army, he was elevated to Command Army of Group Mackensen, a formation that included the German 11th Army, the Austro-Hungarian 3rd Army, and eventually the Bulgarian 1st Army as well. The creation of an army group bearing von Mackensen's personal name was itself extraordinary. Army groups were typically named for their commanders only in the German tradition, and only for the most senior and trusted commanders. To name a multinational formation of 3 armies after him was as close to a public declaration of unique operational genius. The full field marshal's baton would come later in 1916, but by the summer of 1915, von Mackensen was already, in operational terms, the most successful army commander on either side of the entire Eastern Front. After the Great Retreat of the Russian army, von Mackensen forces continued advancing eastward. The campaign expanded beyond its original objectives, pushing deep into Russian-held territory. Von Mackensen advanced up the River Bug as part of the summer Triple Offensive, establishing a reputation as an accomplished exponent of breakthrough tactics. The Triple Offensive was a coordinated German attack across the Eastern Front through the summer of 1915. They drove Russian forces back hundreds of miles, capturing Warsaw in August and clearing virtually all of Russian Poland. Von Mackensen's army group was one of the primary instruments of this sustained advance. By late summer, the entire Eastern Front had stabilized into a new line far to the east of where it had stood a year before. Russia had suffered catastrophic losses, but not yet collapsed. The war in the east was not over yet, and simply entered a new phase. In Falkenhayn, surveying the strategic landscape, made a decision that redirected von Mackensen to understand why the conquest of Serbia was a German strategic priority in autumn of 1915. You need to understand both what Serbia had already done to its larger neighbor and what it represented geopolitically. Serbia in 1914 was a small country of roughly 4.5 million people, landlocked in the Western Balkans, with an army of tough, experienced soldiers hardened by 2 Balkan wars. The victory of the Royal Serbian Army at the Battle of Ser is considered the first Allied victory in the First World War. And the Austro-Hungarian army defeat by Serbia had been called one of the great upsets of modern military history. An empire of 50 million people had been beaten repeatedly by a tiny Balkan kingdom. The damage to Austro-Hungarian prestige was enormous, and the political pressure from Vienna to finally crush Serbia was intense. But beyond prestige, Serbia's strategic position was a critical factor. The defeat of Serbia gave Central Powers temporary mastery over the Balkans, opening up a land route from Berlin to Constantinople, allowing the Germans to resupply the Ottoman Empire for the rest of the war. The Ottoman Empire was fighting on multiple fronts, including Gallipoli, where British forces had landed in April 1915. The Turks were desperately short of artillery ammunition, modern weapons, and military equipment that Germany could provide. But there was no way to deliver these supplies. The land route through Serbia was blocked, and the sea route was controlled by the British Navy. Every week that Serbia remained undefeated was another week that the Ottoman Empire bled out without German resupply. But then something changed. Bulgaria committed to the Central Powers, because during the summer of 1915, the military balance swung in Germany's favor. The timing was not coincidental. Gorlice Tarnow had demonstrated that Germany could win decisive military victories. The Great Retreat showed that Russia was in serious difficulty. If Russia could not protect itself, it certainly could not protect Serbia, and the Central Powers were offering Bulgaria something the Entente could not match. The Central Powers offered Bulgaria, Macedonia, and eastern Serbia, and in case Romania or Greece entered the war, they would be compensated with more land. Before departing for Serbia, von Mackensen addressed his men. His speech, recorded in multiple sources and confirmed across them, was remarkable for a commander about to attack a small nation with overwhelming force. He told his men, quote, "You are not going to the Italian, Russian, or French front. You are going into battle against a new enemy, dangerous, tough, fearless, and sharp. You are going to the Serbian front. Serbs are people who love their freedom and will fight to the last man. Be careful. This small enemy does not cast a shadow on your glory and compromise your success." End quote. He was warning his own soldiers not to underestimate a small force. The Central Powers enjoyed a massive superiority in artillery, with von Mackensen's army group deploying over 2,000 medium and heavy guns versus 330 for the Serbs. This asymmetry was deliberately engineered. Von Mackensen had learned at Gorlice Tarnow that concentrated artillery was the instrument of breakthrough. He applied the same principle in Serbia, assembling the largest artillery barrage possible before the offensive began. Von Mackensen planned to attack Serbia at multiple points on its northern front, while simultaneously coordinating with Bulgaria attacking from the east. The Austro-Hungarian Third Army was to cross the Danube and Sava rivers west of Belgrade and take the high ground south of the Serbian capital. This would not only isolate the city, but also bind many Serbian troops as possible to its defense. At the same time, the German 11th Army under Max von Gallowitz would cross the Danube to the east of Belgrade and push further into the Moravia Valley, threatening the main Serbian forces outside the capital. On the 12th of October, the Bulgarians joined the Central Powers offensive from the east, cutting the rail line that ran north from Salonika and depriving Serbia of reinforcements and artillery ammunition. The offensive began on the night of October 6, 1915, with the bombardment of the Serbian capital, Belgrade growing in intensity until large parts of the city were in flames. One observer recalled the bombardment of Belgrade was one of the fiercest in the history of the present war. Over 50,000 projectiles fell on the town in the first 48 hours. Nothing was spared. The human experience inside Belgrade during these 48 hours is captured in a contemporary account a Serbian diarist recorded. Quote, "Killed cattle lie on the streets. Nobody removes their remains because the city is under constant fire. Nobody even dares to take their dead to the graveyard. People bury them in their backyards. In their meadows, life is unbearable. People are leaving the city for the south." End quote. After 2 days of bombardment, the assault crossing began on October 7th. This was the most technically demanding part of the entire operation. The Danube and Sava were major European rivers with strong currents, subject to sudden flooding, not streams to be waded across, but subsequent water obstacles requiring boats, platoons, and engineers working under fire. Austrian Field Marshal Hermann Kosevs had chosen poor spots for the crossing. A heavy rainstorm caused the Danube to swell. Bridgeheads were established, but progress was slow, as most of the pontoon bridges were destroyed by Serbian artillery or simply swept away by the heavy current. The Serbian defenders were determined beyond what even von Mackensen had anticipated. Relentless Serbian counterattacks threatened to destroy the bridgehead. To secure a safe crossing of the main force, Kovis had to take several islands in the river. These were all well fortified by Serbian defenders, and camouflaged machine guns covered every approach over the water. They could be taken by close combat. After many unsuccessful counterattacks, the Serbian Supreme Command realized on October 11th that the battle for the capital had been lost. Belgrade fell. The ancient city was now in German and Austro-Hungarian hands. Then von Mackensen did something strange. He ordered a monument to be raised on the battleground commemorating the city's defenders. It still stands to this day and is inscribed with the words, quote, "Here rest Serbian heroes," end quote, in both Serbian and German. A rare example in military history of one army building a monument to their enemies. Von Mackensen also wrote in his memoirs about the Serbian defenders, quote, "We fought against an army that we have heard about only in fairy tales, who defended themselves with virtually unprecedented courage, "The moment we conquered Serbia hurt us more than her allies." End quote. With Belgrade fallen and the northern crossing secured, von Mackensen forces pushed south into Serbia's heartland. The Serbian army was now forced southward and westward. Von Mackensen's operational instinct was same as always: pursue relentlessly and deny the enemy time to stabilize. Von Mackensen believed that Serbian forces could still be surrounded and destroyed. He hoped the Serbs would take a stand at Kragujevac. But on October 31st, it became clear that Putnik had decided to withdraw further. The Serbian army abandoned Kragujevac without a fight. They retreated into the mountains, followed by a large group of civilians escaping the trap. This was the frustration that would define the campaign's ultimate verdict. After 2 weeks of fighting, von Mackensen's army had advanced only 30 kilometers into Serbia, far less than had been planned. Due to the tenacity of the Serbian 1st and 2nd armies, the Serbian 2nd Army halted the Bulgarian 1st Army from the east. The Alpine Corps had to be transferred from the Western Front to reinforce the advance. Austria-Hungary sent its 10th Mountain Brigade. Even with these reinforcements, the advance was slower than any other previous von Mackensen's campaign. The moment that defied Serbia's ultimate fate came when Putnik made the painful decision of his command. Rather than surrender or make a final stand and be destroyed, he ordered the Serbian army to retreat across the Albanian mountains to the Adriatic coast. It was a march into one of the most brutal environments in Europe. In winter, without adequate food, clothing, or medical support, the terrain through which the retreat passed was almost the most challenging. The Albanian mountains killed thousands who survived the fighting. Serbian soldiers and civilians died of exposure, starvation, and disease on the mountain pass. By mid-January 1916, Allied naval forces, primarily French and British, began ferrying the remnants of the Serbian army from the Albanian coast to the Greek island of Corfu, with the operation concluding by early February. When von Mackensen returned to Vienna, he was honored by a dinner and personal audience with Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, and was decorated with the magnificent jeweled military merit cross, first class, with diamonds, a unique award for a foreigner. The Serbian campaign reshaped the entire landscape of the war, in ways that extended far beyond the Balkans. Within the German military establishment, von Mackensen's reputation reached new heights. 2 major campaigns in a single year, both executed with the same combination of overwhelming preparation, relentless tempo, and personal command. No other commander on either side could point to a comparable record of sustained offensive success. On the Eastern Front, General Alexei Breslov had launched in June 1916 what would become the most successful Allied offensive of the entire war. The Brusilov offensive struck the Austro-Hungarian armies across a broad front with a tactical sophistication that had never been seen before on the Eastern Front. Multiple simultaneous breakthrough points, preventing the enemy from concentrating reserves at any single threatened sector. The Romanian government signed a treaty with the Allies on the August of 17, 1916, that pledged to declare war on Austria-Hungary by the 28th of August. The timing was driven by Brusilov's success. Romania, watching Austria-Hungary armies collapse under Russian pressure, calculated that now or never was the moment to claim the territories it had coveted for decades. But with the great run of Russian victories, her confidence rose. The problem was, by the time Romania actually declared war, the Brusilov's offensive was already losing momentum. The peak had passed, and the Germans, who had been shifting reserves to stabilize the Eastern Front, now had additional reserves available to deal with Romania. The experienced Field Marshal von Mackensen was sent to Bulgaria to command a combined force of Bulgarian and German troops on the Danube frontier, opposite of Romania's southern border. Von Mackensen wasted no time. On the 2nd of September 1916, the Bulgarian Third Army initiated the Central Powers' first major offensive of the campaign by invading southern Dobruja. This was the region of southern Romania and east of the Danube, a flat, mostly agricultural landscape between the river and the Black Sea coast. It was a natural axis of advance for an army attacking Romania from Bulgaria. The opening blow was the Battle of Turtukaya on the 28th of August. Von Mackensen issued his first directive to the Bulgarian Third Army, ordering it to prepare for a decisive advance aimed at seizing vital crossing points on the Danube. This envisaged the simultaneous capture of both Tortuca and Silistra. However, in a meeting at the Oria-Havista train station, the Bulgarian commander, Tishev, managed to convince von Mackensen to prioritize the capture of Turtukaya over Silistra and concentrate all available forces for that purpose alone. This moment is revealing. Von Mackensen listened to his subordinates' local knowledge and military judgment rather than insisting on his original plan. The same flexibility that characterized his relationship with Sikh was present here with Tishev. The bridgehead at Tartukaya was attacked on September 4th and captured on the 6th. At a cost to the enemy of 22,000 men, the fortress of Tartukaya fell in 2 days. The battle saw Bulgarian troops overwhelm the Romanian garrison, capturing over 25,000 prisoners. 25,000 prisoners in 2 days. The shock to the Romanian command was enormous. The speed with which the victory was achieved was so unexpected by the Central Powers that even Field Marshal von Mackensen, who was usually present on the site of important battles, hadn't planned to arrive on the battlefield until several days after the actual capitulation of the fortress. The consequences were immediate. The scale of the defeat forced Romania to detach several divisions from its armies in Transylvania, greatly reducing the advance there. Romania's strategy had depended on a rapid conquest of Transylvania before Central Power forces could organize a counter-response. Von Mackensen's rapid victory destroyed that strategy. The Romanian armies in Transylvania stopped advancing and began to worry about the southern flank instead. Then the Romanians attempted something bold. On the 15th of September, the Romanian Council of War decided to concentrate on the destruction of von Mackensen's army. The plan known as the Flamanda Offensive consisted of an attack on the Central Powers through a flank and rear shot. After crossing the Danube, on October 1st, 2 Romanian divisions forced a course at Flamanda and created a large bridgehead of 14 kilometers wide and 4 kilometers deep. For a moment, it seemed as though the Romanians had achieved something significant, a crossing of the Danube behind von Mackensen forces, threatening to cut his supply lines and attack him from the rear. It was creative, but it failed for reasons that encapsulate everything wrong with Romania's military situation. The place chosen for the crossing was midway between the 2 German-Belgian points of support, at Tutukaya and Rus. The undertaking failed completely. A German-Bulgarian force sent from Tartukaya practically annihilated the attacking battalions, 15 infantry battalions without artillery support. It was a Romanian shell shortage made manifest in operational terms. The attempt failed, combined with a violent storm during the night of October 1st, which damaged the pontoon bridge over the Danube. This failure of an operation made the Romanian command to cancel the whole operation. After the failure, von Mackensen conducted a second offensive in Dobrija on October 19th. After a month of cautious preparation, the mixed troops under his command managed to defeat the Romanian and Russian troops. The Allies were forced to retreat from Constanța to the Danube Delta. Von Mackensen's object was to occupy the Dobrija and thus block the Russians from the shortest road to Constantinople. This was accomplished in a short time. The German-led attacks continued into October, capturing the sole Romanian seaport of Constanța on October 22, 1916. Constanța was Romania's only Black Sea port. Its loss meant Romania could no longer receive Allied supplies by sea, but von Mackensen was already thinking beyond Dobrija. He understood that capturing Dobrija and the Black Sea coast, while valuable, would not defeat Romania. It would merely compress the Romanians northward. To truly destroy Romanian military power, he needed to cross the Danube into Wallachia and advance on Bucharest from the south, while Falkenhayn's Ninth Army pushed through the Carpathian passes from the north. The key challenge was the Danube itself, nearly 2 kilometers wide, near the planned crossing point, with a strong current. The river was a formidable obstacle under any conditions. Crossing it under fire required meticulous planning and complete operational security. Von Mackensen chose to transfer secretly half of his army near Swistov, preparing to cross the Danube in force. In the misty early morning of November 23rd, the party gathered at several places in the vicinity of Swistov and set up on the river, which at this point was nearly 2 kilometers wide. The enemy on the north bank was taken completely by surprise. At 4 a.m. on November 23rd, von Mackensen's multinational force began crossing the Danube under cover of mist and heavy artillery fire. The mist provided the cover for the first assault wave. This attack caught the Romanians by surprise, and von Mackensen's army was able to advance rapidly towards Bucharest against very weak resistance. On the 25th of November, von Mackensen became the overall commander of all Central Powers forces in Romania. On the 1st of December, the Romanian army began its attack, striking the 20-kilometer-wide gap between the Mackensen and Falkenhayn groups. The initial results were alarming for the Central Powers. Ludendorff considered the situation to be very serious. There was a moment when von Mackensen's Danube army faced potential destruction. Encirclement was a real possibility. Then 2 things happened almost simultaneously that saved the Central Powers. Only the last-minute intervention of the 26th Turkish Infantry Division on the 2nd of December saved von Mackensen's group from encirclement. A Turkish division provided the critical intervention that prevented catastrophe. The second saving factor was an intelligence windfall. The Romanians suffered a setback when a staff car carrying attack plans accidentally drove into a German position and was captured. These plans were vital to the Germans. The Romanians' attack plans fell right into German hands. With those plans, von Mackensen knew exactly what was coming, where, and in what strength. The Romanian counteroffensive was neutralized before it could even be fully deployed. Within 3 days, the attack had been shattered, and the Romanians were retreating everywhere. The Romanian government and royal court fled Bucharest for Iasia in Moldavia. The decision to abandon Bucharest without a fight was made on December 6th. Von Mackensen entered the city at the head of his army, riding in on a white charger. While this moment was great and important for von Mackensen and the Eastern Front, we need to look at the war on a broader scale. On the Western Front at this exact moment, the Battle of the Somme had just ended after 141 days and over 1 million casualties. Verdun had consumed nearly as many. The war of industrial attrition was destroying Germany's manpower and economic resources at a rate that no series of victories could fully compensate for. On January 9, 1917, von Mackensen was awarded the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, becoming one of the only 5 recipients of this honor in World War I. Unfortunately, the capture of Bucharest did not end the Romanian campaign. The Romanian army battered and reduced, but was not destroyed. From now on, the field marshal drove the fleeing enemy ever further to the eastward between the Danube and the mountains. After hard fighting, Buzău was taken from its Russo-Romanian defenders on the 15th of December. After another violent battle, von Mackensen's Danube army took Brilău on the 4th of January 1917. The same operational pattern that had frustrated von Mackensen in Serbia repeated itself in Romania. The Romanian army refused to stand and be destroyed. Around this time, the Russians began sending enormous amounts of reinforcements to Moldavia to prevent an invasion of southern Russia. The remnants of the Romanian army reorganized and retrained with French assistance, provided capable of fighting at a completely different level than it had in the previous year. After several decisive victories in 1917, Romania demonstrated that with proper organization and leadership, its soldiers could fight very effectively. The Battle of Marasesti, in particular, was a genuine Romanian defensive triumph. Von Mackensen's forces attempted to break through the Romanian-Russian defense line and were stopped. His last campaign was an attempt to destroy the Romanian army, which had been reorganized after the Kerensky offensive and occupy the rest of the country. But the attempt failed at the Battle of Marasesti, both sides taking heavy losses, but with the Romanian army victorious. This was the first time in the entire war that von Mackensen's commanded offensive had been stopped and turned back. The German forces available to von Mackensen in 1917 were themselves diminished. The best divisions had been transferred to other fronts, replaced by less experienced or less equipped formations. But then came the event that changed everything, not just for Romania, but for the entire Eastern Front. In November 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia brought Lenin to power, and the new Soviet government immediately sued for peace with Germany. The armistice was signed on December 15th. Von Mackensen was now the military governor of the parts of Romania controlled by the Central Powers. This transition from combat command to military governorship was a change in Mackensen's role and in the nature of the problems he faced. As a commander in the field, his decisions had been operational. As a military governor, his decisions had direct consequences for millions of Romanian civilians living under occupation. What the sources establish is that von Mackensen was not personally cruel. He showed the same respect for Romanian dignity that he had shown for Serbian fighters at Belgrade. He tried within his authority to moderate the harshest economic exploitation that German military and civilian agencies were pressing for. But he was the military governor of an occupied country in wartime, and the structural reality of that position meant that Romanian civilians suffered. Then came the final reversal. As the Western Front collapsed under the pressure of 1918 Allied offensive and Germany's position became unattainable, Romania made one final move. They re-entered the war on the 10th of November in 1918, one day before the armistice at Campan was signed. By re-entering the war at the last possible moment, Romania placed itself legally on the winning side of the Paris Peace Conference. For von Mackensen, the end of the Romanian campaign meant the end of his active military career. He was briefly interrogated after the armistice and then was released. He was now 69 years old. Von Mackensen won most battles he fought in Romania. He crossed the Danube against a defended river, captured Bucharest on his birthday, drove the Romanian army into Moldavia, and watched Germany's position deteriorate despite his victories. He watched the peace treaty imposed on Romania become irrelevant within months. When the Kaiser abdicated, von Mackensen was deeply saddened. During the Weimar Republic years, von Mackensen used his lasting popularity to campaign for the monarchy. This behavior tells you everything about how he processed November 1918. He did not accept the abdication as legitimate, and he did not accept the Republic as a natural successor to the Empire. He spent the next decade and more actively working to restore what had been lost, serving as the exiled Kaiser's personal representative, and Germany writing publicly in defense of the imperial legacy. Following his return to Germany in early 1919, von Mackensen was placed on the retired list of the Imperial German Army. He stepped off the train into a Germany that had been transformed beyond recognition. The army that had been his home for 50 years had been dissolved and replaced by a Reichswehr of 100,000 men. The city von Mackensen had known as the confident capital of a triumph empire looked, felt, and sounded like a place in the grip of a nervous breakdown. His decision to retire stemmed from profound loyalty to Kaiser Wilhelm II, to whom he had personally sworn allegiance as adjutant and field commander. In retirement, von Mackensen resided on a private estate in Schmidberg, Saxony, where he devoted time to reflecting on the war and its aftermath through writing. His family's circumstances in these years were mixed. His son, Hans, was building a diplomatic career. His other son, Eobard, after the armistice in 1918, remained in the army, serving in the Reichswehr, and also briefly joining a right-wing paramilitary group fighting in the Baltic states. The Stahlhelm was the organization with which von Mackensen became publicly associated from around 1924 onward. The Stahlhelm was a German World War I veterans organization, which was active from 1918 to 35. It served as a rallying point for nationalists. The Stahlhelm rallies of the late 1920s were extraordinary events, mass gathering of veterans that combined military patronage and monarchist nostalgia. By 1930, the Stahlhelm claimed 500,000 members, making the largest paramilitary organization in the Republic. During the German presidential election of 1932, von Mackensen supported Hindenburg against Hitler. But you might be asking, why did he prefer Hindenburg? The reasons were multiple and interconnected. Hindenburg was a known person. He was at least comprehensible within the framework of the world von Mackensen understood. Everything in von Mackensen's Prussian officer culture told him to follow tradition. In 1933, Hermann Goering appointed him to the Prussian state legislature. This appointment was a clear statement of intent. The new government wanted von Mackensen's association. His appearance in his imperial uniform at nationalist socialist functions gave the new government something enormously valuable, a visual and symbolic connection between the Third Reich and the Second one. On March 17, 1935, during the Hindenburg ceremony in Berlin, he stood along Hitler and von Blumberg, on occasion documented in photographs that symbolized the government's cooperation of imperial figures. In response to his public visibility, Hitler gave von Mackensen 1,250 acres of land in Breslau, Prussia. Von Mackensen responded by hosting a banquet and inviting Hitler. When World War II finally began, he held no military command, and he was not involved in the planning or execution of the campaign. Then, in 1941, Kaiser Wilhelm II died at the age of 82. The day of the funeral was June 9th. The mourners included August von Mackensen, fully dressed in his old Imperial Life Hussar uniform, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and Reichskommissar for the Netherlands, Arthur Sees in court, alongside a few other military advisors. Some sources state that von Mackensen symbolically placed his field marshal's cloak over the Kaiser's coffin at the funeral, and it looks like in the end, the Kaiser got to see Paris fall after all. Von Mackensen made his journey to the Netherlands to pay his last respects to the last German emperor. This was the final act of the personal loyalty that had shaped the second half of his life. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. American forces were advancing from the west. Von Mackensen was 95 years old by now, living at his home in the province of Hanover. According to some reports, von Mackensen was briefly captured by the British Second Army at his home during the closing weeks of the Second World War. Von Mackensen would later die on November 8, 1945, at the age of 95 in Hanover, Germany. He died 3 days before the 20th anniversary of the armistice that ended the First World War. He spent his whole life dedicated to fighting for his nation and his people, By the time he died, the Germany that he knew no longer existed, except only in his heart. He is buried in the Cella Cemetery in Lower Saxony. Thank you for watching till the end. Tell me what you think about this man or his life in the comments below. If you like this type of content, subscribe for future videos.